The next time you walk down an older street in any major American city, stop. Do not look at the storefronts. Do not look at the traffic. Look up. Look at the windows. Not the ones with glass in them. Look at the ones that have been bricked over. You have walked past them your entire life, and you filed them away as renovation, as cost-cutting, as some landlord in the 1970s who decided he did not want to pay for the glass anymore. That is what most people assume, and I assumed the same thing for a long time. But here is the first problem with that assumption. The bricked-in windows are almost never random. They follow a pattern. The largest windows, the ones with the deepest sills, the ones with the most elaborate exterior stonework, those are the ones that got sealed. Not the small utility windows on the side walls. Not the basement casements. The primary apertures. The ones that, by the official story, should have been the most valuable real estate on the facade. Does that look like a cost-cutting decision to you? Because here is what nobody talks about. The sills on those sealed windows are anywhere from 14 to 36 inches deep, carved stone, in most cases granite or limestone. Some of them contain recessed channels along the interior edge, channels that do not connect to the glass, channels that connect to the wall. I was in a building in St. Louis, a former exhibition hall built in 1887 during a demolition survey. A contractor had pulled the brick infill out of one of the sealed window bays. What was behind it was not what any of us expected, and that detail has stayed with me for every year since. Let us start with the numbers, because the numbers are where the official explanation begins to fall apart. The earliest systematically documented wave of window infilling in American urban architecture is traced to the late 1800s, specifically the period between 1893 and 1911. That is not my framing. That is the framing used by the Historic American Building Survey, which catalogued structural modifications to pre-1900 commercial buildings across 14 major American cities between 1934 and 1941. What that survey found, buried in the supplementary appendices that almost no one reads, is that of the 4,300 pre-1900 buildings they documented in detail, 61% showed evidence of primary window modification. Not secondary windows, not basement apertures, primary facade windows, sealed, reduced, or repositioned within a single documented renovation period that clustered between 1898 and 1914. 61% in a 16-year window. The new codes mandated fire-resistant construction, that is true, and it is also where the logic breaks completely. The new codes mandated egress standards and structural reinforcement. They did not mandate the removal of functional windows. Sealing a window does not make a building more fire-resistant. In most configurations, it makes evacuation harder. The code changes do not explain the pattern, they provide cover for it. So let us look at what was actually built, because the engineering is where this gets difficult to dismiss. The windows in question are not decorative. This is the point that took me the longest to accept, because we have been trained to think of ornate 19th century architecture as performative, as showing off, as expensive aesthetics for the sake of wealthy clients. But the sills are not decorative. A 28-inch granite sill on a commercial building is not there to look impressive. Granite is priced by the cubic foot, and in the 1880s, a running foot of dressed granite sill at that depth cost the equivalent of several days of skilled labor wages. You do not specify that unless the depth serves a function, and the function becomes clearer when you look at what the builders put inside the sill cavity. In documented cases across Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and New Orleans, structural investigators working on renovation projects between 1970 and 2004 have found the same recurring features. A recessed channel between 1.5 and 3 inches wide running along the inner lower edge of the sill. In several cases, that channel connects to a vertical conduit inside the wall itself. Not a drain, not a condensation channel. The angle is wrong for drainage. The conduit runs upward. Upward into a wall that, in every documented case, terminates at the roofline in a feature that was also modified or removed in that same 1898 to 1914 window. The investment required to build these features was not trivial. It was not decorative. Whoever specified them knew exactly what they were building, and they built it into hundreds of thousands of structures across the country. In 1973, a structural engineer named Harold Fenwick was hired to assess a former civic building in Cincinnati, Ohio, built in 1881, which was being converted to residential use. His job was routine: document the load-bearing walls, flag any hidden voids, clear the structure for conversion. What Fenwick found in the east wall behind a bricked-in window bay on the 3rd floor was a cavity approximately 18 inches wide by 6 feet tall, lined on 3 sides with a material he described in his filed report as a vitreous compound consistent with kiln-fired ceramic applied in a single continuous layer without visible seams. Inside that cavity was a copper sleeve, corroded but structurally intact, approximately 4 inches in diameter, open at the top and bottom, descending through the floor into the structure below. He filed that report with the Cincinnati Historic Preservation Office. It is still in their archive. His words in the accompanying letter read, "The configuration of this cavity serves no purpose I can identify within conventional structural or ventilation practice. I recommend further investigation before conversion proceeds." Further investigation did not proceed. The conversion moved forward. The cavity was filled with spray insulation and drywalled over. That letter was never cited in any subsequent architectural history of the building. It was never picked up by a publication. It sits in a filing box in a municipal archive in Ohio, and Harold Fenwick died in 2001 without ever having received a response to his recommendation. But Fenwick was not the only one. In 1988, a restoration team working on a Haussmann-era building on the Boulevard de Magenta in Paris documented an identical ceramic-lined cavity behind a sealed window bay. Identical dimensions, identical copper sleeve, identical vertical orientation. A conservation architect named Sophie Broulard published her findings in a French-language heritage journal in 1991. She noted the similarity to features documented by a British investigator named Thomas Ederle in a Victorian commercial block in Manchester in 1979. Ederle had called it, in his report to the Manchester City Council, a sealed pneumatic or conductive passage of unknown original function. Paris, Manchester, Cincinnati. Then Vienna, where a 2002 renovation of a Ringstrasse-era building produced the same configuration, documented by a preservation engineer named Klaus Martensen and filed with the Austrian Federal Monuments Office. And Boston, where a 1996 survey of Beacon Hill commercial properties flagged the same recessed channels and sills across no fewer than 9 separate buildings on a single block. Not similar, not inspired by each other, not born from the same regional tradition. Identical. The same ceramic lining, the same copper sleeve diameter, the same vertical conduit orientation. Buildings constructed on separate continents, by separate architects, for separate clients, in separate decades. Identical schematics do not emerge from coincidence. They emerge from a shared technical source, a manual, a standard, a system that someone designed, distributed, and then worked very hard to make disappear. And there is one more detail that makes coincidence impossible to maintain. The sealed windows are not randomly distributed within their facades. In building after building across the American and European examples, the sealed apertures are concentrated on specific orientations, northeast and northwest exposures overwhelmingly, not south-facing windows, which receive the most direct sunlight and which any cost-cutting renovation would logically preserve. The south-facing windows were kept. The northeast and northwest windows were sealed. In 23 of the 31 documented buildings I have traced across 3 countries, the sealed primary windows face within 15 degrees of the northeast or northwest cardinal points. Consistently, across buildings separated by decades and oceans, consistently, deliberately, as though orientation mattered for a reason that had nothing to do with light. Standard solar analysis makes this inexplicable. Northeast and northwest windows receive the least direct solar gain of any orientation in the northern hemisphere. If you are sealing windows to reduce heating costs, you seal those last. If you are sealing windows to reduce glare, you seal the south-facing ones. The northeast and northwest orientation is the last thing a cost optimization logic produces. Unless what mattered was not the sun, the physical evidence has already made the case. What comes next is simply asking what system that evidence belonged to. Nikola Tesla's notes, seized by the FBI on the morning of January 8, 1943, the day after his death, were held under classification and not released in any meaningful form until 1983, when a partial declassification was processed through the Office of Alien Property. Those are documented facts. The seizure happened, the classification happened, the 40-year gap happened. What Tesla was working on in the years before his death was not, as the simplified version of the story goes, just wireless electricity. His Wardenclyffe project, begun in 1901 and demolished in 1917, was designed to use the Earth itself as a conductor, the ionosphere and the ground as the 2 plates of a planetary capacitor. Energy transmitted not through wires but through resonance, atmospheric and terrestrial resonance. Tesla wrote in 1904, "The Earth is alive with electrical potential. It needs only to be tapped at the right frequency and at the right geometry of reception." The right geometry of reception. A ceramic-lined cavity oriented toward the northeast, containing a copper sleeve, open at both ends, set into the wall of a building at a specific height, connected to the roofline through a vertical conduit. That is not a fireplace, that is not a vent, that is a receiver geometry. And if Tesla in 1944 was describing infrastructure that needed only to be tapped, the most uncomfortable question is whether some of that infrastructure was already built. Not by Tesla. before Tesla, and whether Tesla knew it, and whether that is the real reason someone wanted his papers locked in a federal vault for 40 years. If you want to go deeper on this and access the supplementary document breakdown I have been building on the physical case files, that research is available through the Chronicles membership. Link is below. What I am putting together there goes considerably further than what I can cover in a single video. Now let us talk about the window, not the literal window, the window of time. The modifications happened in a specific band, 1895 to 1912, not gradually, not across a century of slow evolution. In a single generation, in cities across the United States and Western Europe, the same set of architectural features were systematically eliminated, sealed, or rendered illegal. Three forces converged in that same window, and the convergence is not coincidental. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil achieved effective monopoly control of American petroleum distribution by 1882 and had consolidated the kerosene and heating fuel markets by the mid-1890s. The commercial incentive to eliminate any competing energy infrastructure was not theoretical. It was the defining strategic priority of the largest corporation in the world. Simultaneously, the coal and timber cartels operating through industry associations including the National Fuel Merchants Association, founded in 1894, began lobbying state and municipal legislatures for building code reforms. The argument was fire safety. The mechanism was the systematic redefinition of what constituted a legal building configuration, and then the codes. Beginning in Boston in 1896, moving to New York in 1899, Chicago in 1901, Philadelphia in 1903, and appearing in identical language in London's LCC building bylaws of 1898, the phrase standard combustion configuration began appearing as a defined legal term. A building that did not meet the standard combustion configuration required remediation. Remediation meant sealing or removing the non-compliant openings, standard combustion configuration. That phrase appears in building codes from Boston, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and London within a 7-year span in nearly identical regulatory language, coordinated across jurisdictions with no formal international building standards body in existence at the time. Regional tradition does not produce identical sleeve diameters on separate continents. Parallel evolution does not produce identical legal language in cities with no coordinating body. That is coordination. The old window configuration was not made obsolete, it was made illegal. There is a significant difference. Obsolescence is a market outcome, illegality is a decision. Someone decided, and the someone had enough reach to place the same phrase into the legal code of cities on 2 continents within a single decade. The suppression did not stop in 1912. It continued, more quietly, in a form that is actually harder to fight than outright censorship. In 1994, a researcher named Patricia Ouellette at the University of Montreal submitted a formal proposal to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for a study titled Anomalous Aperture Features in Pre-1900 North American Institutional Architecture. The proposal requested access to municipal building records in 6 cities and funding for physical survey work in 4 of them. The proposal was rejected. The rejection letter cited insufficient evidence of scholarly consensus regarding the phenomenon under study. You need consensus to study something. You build consensus by studying it. The circularity of that logic is not an accident, it is the mechanism. Ouellette self-published her preliminary findings in 1997 through a small press in Quebec. The book received no academic reviews. It is not indexed in any major architectural history database. It is available in physical form in 11 libraries in North America, all of them small regional collections. In 2009, a retired civil engineer named George Tamblin requested access to the sealed structural records of a federally designated historic building in Washington, D.C., which had undergone window modification in 1903. The request was denied on the grounds that the records were held in a format not compatible with public reading room access and that digitization was not currently funded. The records exist. They are not destroyed. They are held in a format that makes them practically inaccessible to anyone without institutional resources and years to spend on bureaucratic appeals. That is not violent suppression, it is bureaucratic silence. And bureaucratic silence is the most durable form of burial there is, because it requires no conspiracy to maintain. It only requires inertia, funding priorities, and a definition of what counts as a legitimate research question. The most effective way to keep information contained is not to destroy it. It is to make it impossible to study officially, and they have been remarkably effective. So let us return to the question we started with. What were they sealing off? The physical evidence, taken on its own terms, points to a distributed infrastructure of receiver apertures built into the primary facades of large institutional and commercial structures across the industrialized world in the 19th century. The sill channels collected atmospheric or terrestrial electrical potential. The copper sleeves conducted it vertically through the wall cavity. The roofline features, now mostly gone, completed the circuit or the resonance geometry, feeding usable energy into the building's interior systems. Buildings across 6 countries share the same cavity dimensions, the same ceramic lining, the same copper sleeve specification, the same orientation pattern. They were built to the same standard. They were sealed to the same standard, and the legal language that required the sealing appeared in coordinated form across jurisdictions with no formal coordinating body. That is what the physical record shows, taken on its own terms without adding anything. The reason it was destroyed is not complicated, once you accept what it was. What moved through those windows could not be metered, it could not be billed, it could not be controlled by anyone who needed to sell you the alternative. A fuel monopoly is only a monopoly if there is no other fuel. A power grid is only necessary if there is no other way to power your building. The infrastructure that was sealed in those windows represented the thing that every emerging energy cartel in the 1890s needed to not exist, so they made it not exist, legally, efficiently. With building codes and rejection letters and access restrictions and 40-year classification orders, every major city in America is full of these buildings. They are on your street. You have walked past them today, probably. The evidence is still there in the stone, in the depth of the sill, in the ceramic lining behind the brick infill, in the orientation of the apertures that someone decided, very deliberately, you should never see light come through again. The next time you walk past a bricked-over window on an old building, stop. Look at the stonework around it, look at the depth of the arch, look at which direction it faces, and ask yourself one question. Who decided this window needed to be sealed, and why?